back. Executive Director of the West African Network for Peace Building, Mr. Chukwuemeka Eze, joins us now on the program. He's in Banjul, Gambia. Mr. Eze, thank you for joining us on Diplomatic Channel. Do you see the late Zimbabwean leader, Robert Mugabe, as a hero?
I think that it's proper to describe Robert Mugabe as a national hero. If you look at what he stood for and the kind of things that he did for his country, it will be proper to regard him as a national hero. Ranging from the moment he spoke unequivocally at the UN General Assembly about the dominance of the whites and the need for his people to be given the opportunity to govern themselves and also to have their land for themselves. If you also look at the role he played in terms of the freedom of the people of Zimbabwe and also the things he stood for, he is a proper national hero. But I'm also aware that there have been a lot of controversy whether he should be regarded as a national hero based on the fact that he was not able to maintain and respect the ethics of democracy, including the length of his stay in power. And I think that's a very huge lesson for African leaders, that it doesn't matter the amount of energy and effort you put into making your country look very good, which Robert Mugabe actually did in his first and second tenure. I think the most important thing is to know that it is better to leave the stage when the ovation is loudest. And I think that's why it is difficult now to classify Robert Mugabe in the way and manner people like Nelson Mandela have been classified. But in all, I think that the people of Zimbabwe have a right to be on either side of history as it relates to Robert Mugabe. Some can convincingly define him as a national hero and maintain that. And I think that's why he's receiving the kind of attention, international attention he's receiving. But others can also, in an attempt to teach other African leaders a lesson, decide to say that he did not represent the true democracy of today. And therefore, they can decide not to recognize him as a national leader.
Well, I mean, he did outlive his welcoming government, declaring one time, "Only God who appointed me will remove me, not the MDC," referring here to the opposition. "Not the British, only God will remove me," he said. And that was said at an election rally in 2008.
Well, I think that's exactly what I'm heading to. Rightly or wrongly, even at some point, that a lot of people started saying that Mugabe was a dedicated dictator. I think that, and also if you look at the background where he's coming from, the kind of energy with which the West decided to castigate Robert Mugabe based on some of these antecedents that I've mentioned before, I think that just simply because he did not live up to the tenets of democracy, and then, of course, coupled with that is how the economy of Zimbabwe started dwindling in his presence under his regime. A lot of people have described that as international sabotage. But whether it is right or wrong, the fact is that he was the president at the time that the economy of Zimbabwe crashed to the extent that people were not sure whether if they go to the market and buy a loaf of bread, by the time they are getting back in the afternoon, whether the price of that bread will remain the same. The inflation was very high. The human rights abuses was also very high. Then the opening of democratic ethos also was difficult. Opposition was clamped down on. If you remember what happened to people like Morgan Shangari and all of that. So the international community, especially the British, capitalized on that to castigate Robert Mugabe. And that is more reason why up to today, a lot of people are finding it difficult where to classify him, whether as a national hero or as a dictator that refused to leave power until the subtle coup d'etat that removed him took place.
Well, I imagine he would have had a lot to say about what's going on in South Africa. What do you think he would have said, though, about the recent xenophobic attacks?
I think that if Robert Mugabe was alive, Robert Mugabe, like Kwame Nkrumah, like late Muammar Gaddafi wanted a united Africa. Zimbabwe was home for South Africans during the apartheid regime. I think that Mugabe would have stood on the podium of African Union to call the current president and the leadership of South Africa government to order, to remind them of the price that African states and citizens played and the price they paid to emancipate South Africa from the clutches of the leadership of white minority during the apartheid regime. I think that there are few leaders on the African continent today that can still stand up to either the bullies of the West or on internal bad governance and bad leadership in Africa. So if Robert Mugabe was alive today, especially occupying the position of the president of Zimbabwe, I think that he would have made a statement using the various platforms that exist on the African continent, whether at the level of SADC or at the level of African Union, to call the South African leadership to order, to ask them to remind their citizens of history and the need for a united Africa. And I think that apart from Robert Mugabe and Gaddafi, there are very few voices we hear today about the spirit of Pan-Africanism. And I think, in my opinion, that is really very unfortunate.
In the end, would you say that Africa has lost indeed an icon, one remarkable leader based on the lessons learned on issues of governance and keeping leaders accountable?
I think that in many ways, Africa have lost an icon. Africa have also lost a voice on the international scene. Africa have lost one of his very best in terms of ability to articulate issues. Mugabe, for all the African Union summit that I attended, Mugabe was one of those African leaders that spoke without a paper in his hand. He spoke from his heart. There are few of his kind still existing as leaders. But are there lessons to learn from the controversy today surrounding whether Mugabe is a hero or not? Yes, there are lessons. The key lesson from that is that African leaders should respect the tenets of democracy, should respect term limits, and leave power when they are supposed to leave power. It doesn't matter how well you have served. It is important for African leaders to groom those who will take over from them and even become better than them. Otherwise, at death, this kind of controversy of whether or not somebody that played the important role Mugabe played can be regarded as a hero or not.
Thanks again, Mr. Chukwuemeka. It's a pleasure having you on Diplomatic Channel.
Always my pleasure joining you on Diplomatic Channel. Thank you very much.